Controversy reigned for a little bit about how far away that shot actually traveled before it struck the Indian. At the time, it was estimated to be right about 1,000 yards. But later on, a team of U.S. Army surveyors calculated it at slightly more than 1,500. Hello everyone and welcome back to AmmoMart.com. Some weeks ago, I did a little video on the exploits of the James Gang. I hope you guys enjoyed that one, and out of that, Matt and I decided that we would maybe pick some figures out of the American West and do a little bit of a history and sort of introduce them to the modern world. One of the logical choices when you decide to do that sort of thing is a man named William Billy Dixon. My cowboy action shooting coach, Scott Rose, actually modeled his cowboy action name or stage name after Billy Dixon. So I was vaguely aware of his long shot, of course, at Adobe Walls, but really didn't know that much about the rest of his life and history. So when I started researching this, I was actually blown away by some of the facts that I uncovered. William Billy Dixon was born in 1850 in what would be now known as the Panhandle of West Virginia. As was very common during that period of time, by the time he turned 12, both of his parents had died. So he relocated himself to Missouri to live with an uncle for a very brief period of time, perhaps less than a year. Also common to that period of time were young men 13 or 14 years old had an expectancy to support themselves through hard work and whatever sort of labor that they could find. So Billy ends up working a bunch of lumber camps along the Missouri River. It's unclear about where he developed his prowess with firearms or how that part of his life came to be, but what is certainly known is that by the time he was in his middle to late teens, he was known and had a reputation as being an excellent marksman. That also wouldn't be uncommon because firearms were life safety tools for sure back then. Well beyond a luxury and certainly a necessity, and a lot of times there would be local shooting events, marksmanship displays, and shooting contests where perhaps his reputation began to emerge. This reputation will become very important because out of that comes job opportunities. If you were handy with a gun, you could get on as a scout, as sort of armed protection for bands of Easterners that are continually pushing their way west. Billy actually started working for a government contractor as a mule skinner. That meant he handled mule teams handling supplies and whatever headed into the frontier. They didn't actually skin the mules. At some point, Billy offered his services as a civilian scout to the United States military. During this period of time, sort of as he was coming of age in his early 20s, the American buffalo hunt was in full cry. Millions of these animals were being harvested all over the West, but particularly in the panhandle of Texas and southern Oklahoma. The hunting parties would typically launch from places like Dodge City in Kansas and push their way southwest into the Great Plains. The problem with all of that is when you did that back then, you were undoubtedly going to run into Comanche and Kiowa Indians. The Comanche and Kiowa, lords of the plains, had been given the white man the business in that part of the country since at least the 1830s. In 1864, at the first Battle of Adobe Walls, Kit Carson and 300 U.S. Army soldiers battled 1,200 Comanche and a smattering of other tribes basically to a standstill. And that battle is going to become important in the life of Billy Dixon 10 years later. The Americans in '64 departed the field in retreat, but somehow managed to call it a victory. But on the other hand, so did the Comanche. Adobe Walls was a very common sort of primitive settlement that you would find on the American frontier. It was designed specifically to supply buffalo hunters pushing west. It didn't even have Adobe Walls when the settlement was first established in 1834. It was just basically a patch of teepees and some ramshackle log cabins. Sometime around 1845, they erected Adobe Walls and made it sort of like fort-like architecture that people could get refuge behind in case of Indian raids which came often. In the period of time that followed between then and '64, some of the walls had already begun to crumble, but did provide enough cover for the U.S. Army to survive. So flash forward to June of 1874. An amazing story is about to unfold. Billy Dixon agrees to take 27 or 28, the number kind of varies, other buffalo hunters back to Adobe Walls for a buffalo hunt. They had already hunted out the buffalo around the Kansas area where he would eventually lead this party from, Dodge City, in June of 1874. They arrive at Adobe Walls and they find basically a small collection of 5 buildings. They were owned by individuals that stayed there full time. An individual named Hanrahan, he'll become important in a minute, owned the general store. They had a sod saloon, things like that people would need. Now, importantly, on the way, they encountered a small band of Indians, and these Indians apparently reported to the Comanche, and importantly, Chief Quanah Parker, that the white men and their hunting party were headed for Adobe Walls. Dixon and his party arrived at Adobe Walls on June 27, 1874. They sought shelter where they could, scattered across the 5 buildings, and the first 2 casualties, unfortunately, in the battle about to unfold, will be 2 brothers who were sleeping in a wagon out front and had no shelter when the fighting began. And an unfortunate turn of circumstances, perhaps for the Indians, was that one of the ridgepoles broke in one of the buildings, and they were worried about collapse. So they had most of the hunting party up trying to shore up the building when the Indians attacked at dawn. This battle raged on for 3 days, and one of the most interesting aspects of this story, at least to me, is the fact that in this 27 or 28 man hunting party was a 20-year-old Bat Masterson. So Bat and Billy Dixon were actually staying in the sod saloon. If you're about to be sieged by Comanches, the saloon's a good place to be in my mind. They fought from there for the next 3 days. The casualties on both sides were fairly light. If you look at the amount of people involved in the fighting, which some people estimate could have been as many as 700 Comanche and Kiowa. Initially, they got close enough to the buildings to rap on the windows with their buttstocks. But the fighting was up close, and the hunting party, because they were hunting buffalo, brought weapons more typical to this than ones designed for short-end fighting. Sure, they had pistols and the whatnot as you would, but it really wasn't the way they were heavily equipped. Their initial charge almost brought them early success, but not quite. And then the Indians made a huge mistake. They sort of backed out into rifle range, and there would be shots taken both sides as the next 2 days wore on. On the 3rd day of the battle, with a borrowed rifle, Billy Dixon went outside to a rocky outcrop that, too bad for the Indians, he had actually shot from before. He was very familiar with Adobe Walls, and for betting games, they would go out there and take shots with their rifle using that sort of rocky outcrop as a support. It was reported that over a mile away, an Indian had went out onto a bluff to get a better look at what was going on. Everyone sort of encouraged Billy to go take a shot at this poor Native American, which he did, killing him and knocking him off his horse. Now, what follows is quite an interesting story, because in his own biography, Billy Dixon only talked about that shot for less than a paragraph. And for the rest of his life, he referred to that shot as a scratch shot, meaning it was pretty much dumb luck. Controversy reigned for a little bit about how far away that shot actually traveled before it struck the Indian. At the time, it was estimated to be right about 1,000 yards. But later on, a team of U.S. Army surveyors calculated it at slightly more than 1,500. What's interesting about it is he borrowed the rifle from one of the building owners, Hanrahan, and he was using a Sharps 50-90 caliber rifle. Dixon was originally equipped with a .45 caliber rifle, but he knew it didn't have quite the push to go out that far. So he actually did this presumably with a rifle that he was not very familiar with. So Not sure how much luck can be involved when you also have going against you an unfamiliar sort of setup to the rifle you're actually going to shoot. That shot encouraged the Indians to back away in retreat. Also, coupled with that, the chief of the Comanche, perhaps their greatest and certainly their last greatest chief, Quanah Parker, was involved in the fighting at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, and he was wounded. In typical fashion, the Comanche believed that that was bad medicine. When the chief is hit, that means you can also be hit, and that also perhaps persuaded them to retreat off the field. Oddly enough, Billy Dixon didn't really become such of a national hero because of what he had done at Adobe Walls. Believe it or not, 1874 and its adventures were not done for Billy. In September of 1874, while carrying dispatches with some other U.S. Army soldiers, he's attacked once again by a small band of Indians. They got shot up pretty good, several Americans wounded, and they sought refuge in what would come to be known as the Battle of the Buffalo Wallow. One of the peculiar things you could find in the landscape out west at the time was something called a buffalo wallow, which is a hollowed out sort of piece of ground 10 foot in diameter. The soldiers and Billy scrambled into this little sort of dugout, used their knives in their hands to lift the sand up to make some better cover, and would sit in an upright position and shoot at the advancing Indians. Most of the accounts say that pretty much every time the gun went off, an Indian went down. But as several Americans were wounded and still lying in open cover, when he could, Billy went out and rescued at least 2 of them, saving their lives. Some of them did die later on, but for his actions, he was actually awarded the Medal of Honor. And in typical government fashion, around 1916, a U.S. Army review, and why they review stuff like this, I have no idea, decided that he wasn't eligible for the Medal of Honor because he was actually a civilian scout. So he won it, and he lost it, and then it was restored back to him sometime around the 1920s. And that medal you can still see on display in Canyon, Texas at the Great Plains Museum. Billy continued his faithful service to the U.S. military until he retired in 1884. Oddly enough, even though he spent most of his life from Adobe Walls Battle II onward sort of downplaying what went on there, he actually built a house and settled right near the original site of the Adobe Walls. He actually became a postmaster there for 20 years and the first sheriff of the newly formed Hutchinson County. He married a little later on in his life, and he and his wife Olive moved to Oklahoma where they had 7 children. He told her his life story on his deathbed of pneumonia before he passed away in 1913. After he died, sometime around 1929, Billy's body was reinterred at a site in Adobe Walls that still has the same grave marker we'll show you a picture of here on the video. So it's kind of interesting to me, a little bit of a mystery, why a guy would, one, sort of downplay what happened at a very pivotal moment of his life, but basically decide to return there for what remained of most of his life. I think it goes a lot to demonstrating the character of men back then, and legends of the Old West were pretty much normal people to a point. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and we're looking forward to picking out some more historical figures in the future. And if you have some suggestions, please leave them in the comments. Thanks, and don't be afraid to like and subscribe.